two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Teresa Alt. I'm here today with John King. He is experienced with matters of, all sorts of regulatory codes, both from on the job and from reading about it. And he is going to talk about single stair reform. John King, you are claiming that something in our building code is making buildings too expensive. Tell us about it.
So there's a lot of aspects of building code that are very well intentioned. They're typically changes that are made or sections that are added to address distinct problems or in response to even sometimes tragedies that have occurred. But a problem that occurs is there's not always consideration to what new problems may be caused by adding on to the complexity of these codes or or how they might, say, drive up costs. One example of this that's been getting a lot of attention in urbanist and architectural discussion lately is what's called single stair reform. In the United States, you'll notice very often that the shape of new apartment buildings is very different than you might see in Europe or Asia. They tend to be much larger for one. And that's driven in part by a requirement that any building of more than 3 stories in the United States, any multifamily building, is generally required to have multiple separate exit stairways with long corridors spanning the entire length of the building connecting them. And the thinking here is that it promotes fire safety. It was a response to some, horrible tragedies that occurred in the earlier part of last century, and the idea was that multiple means of egress from a building would make it fundamentally safer. But it's had some unintended consequences. For one, when you effectively cut a building in half with the staircase, you change the shape of apartments. You tend to divide buildings up into smaller spaces, which has in part encouraged a proliferation of smaller units, but also the requirement for this large central staircase, or this large central corridor rather, with a second staircase, takes up a good amount of the floor area of a building. In a lot of cases, this staircase and corridor requirement can eat up an extra 10%, sometimes even more, of the usable floor area of a building. And now by taking up 10% more floor area, you're effectively driving up the whole cost another 10% at least. And the cost, even in a 6 story building for a full second staircase, can sometimes be hundreds of thousands of dollars. Taking collectively, these reduce the amount of floor area that we have for homes, and they also drive up the cost of construction pretty considerably. Because of that, these smaller buildings don't tend to be very economical. And you also often can't fit them on small lots that exist in cities now, which is why you tend to see, the buildings that do get constructed are these massive block long, very significant developments rather than the kind of small, in character and in scale buildings that you see in older neighborhoods, for instance on the Ithaca Commons. uh, Now, at the time that those requirements were put in place, no one was thinking that this would, reshape the basic form of new buildings in urban neighborhoods. um, but because of the financial incentives that are created when you when you mandate certain construction features, it's had the unintended consequence of really reshaping how our neighborhoods look.
Well, usually, and so you are against this requirement for two staircases in
Not
a,
not completely. It's when you get to a building of a certain size, I think it
yeah.
absolutely still makes sense. But there are a lot of American cities, including New York City, and also Seattle, among some others, that allow for buildings with a single staircase of up to 6 stories, and in some places up to 10. Because they've looked at the evidence, they've looked at the forms of safety that can be accomplished in these through other means, and realized that you are still creating very fundamentally safe buildings that can be quite a lot larger than the ones we allow now. And that's in part because building techniques have incorporated a huge number of really remarkable life-saving fire safety advancements since the early part of last century when these requirements were put in place. Things like fire-resistant materials and fully sprinklered buildings. And so that envelope of building heights and sizes where a single staircase can still be remarkably safe is really expanded compared to what it used to be. And there's some good evidence from those cities that those buildings are remarkably safe as well.
Okay, so there are existing statistics that come from those
Yes.
cities.
Yeah, Pew Trust or Pew Charities, which is the parent organization, I believe, of Pew Research, did an analysis recently, and they found generally in the 11-year period they looked at, there were only 4 fire fatalities in the entire country in these single stair apartment buildings. And the investigation found that none of the 4 had anything to do with the lack of a second staircase. And generally speaking, if we can enable more modern multifamily apartment buildings to be constructed, that would do far more for fire safety than the staircase requirement could. That same organization did research finding that the rate of fire fatalities per million occupants in newer multifamily buildings, those constructed with modern safety features since the year 2000, was something like 1.2 million, or sorry, 1.2 fatalities per million occupants. Whereas in detached single family homes in the United States, which is what's going to be built in sprawling suburban neighborhoods if we can't build in our cities, that rate was nearly 7.7 per million. And again, this comes from things like the sprinkler systems, the fire resistant barriers, and other fire, and life safety techniques that are put into these buildings. Similarly, some of the cities in the United States that allow this, such as New York City and Seattle, have well below national average fire fatality rates. And other countries where this style of construction is quite common, for instance, the Netherlands, have sometimes as low as 1/3 the rate of fire fatalities that you see in the United States. So really, when you dig into the data on fire safety, you're going to find that it's really detached single family homes, which are much less regulated in terms of fire safety than our modern multifamily buildings. Those are the real driver of fire risk to human health. And so by making them more affordable and unlocking more modern multifamily construction in our cities, where one, there's just a huge amount of demand, you're actually helping people move into a much safer form of construction. Now, that's not to say that you just, assume that the multifamily building is going to be inherently safer. Usually when you switch to only a single staircase versus two, there's other fire safety measures that you put in place. Additional fire barriers, for instance, and making sure that hallway lengths going to your exit stairs are no more than a maximum amount of distance. Um, but because we already have those requirements in place in New York City. And somewhere like Ithaca, we have a great example within our own state to pull from, where it's been demonstrated to work. So we won't be reinventing the wheel if we want to try something like that here.
Okay, and I take it if a bunch of people came to Common Council and spoke before the meetings and urged that this be adopted, could Common Council simply vote to make such changes?
No, so it would be a little more complicated to have it blanketly legal. We would have to request the New York State Department of State to give us essentially a variance to the building codes for the city of Ithaca, similar to the one allowed for New York City. But there are some other ways to do this. The building code, as adopted now, does have provisions that state that if you can prove under engineering supervision, which means once it's been reviewed and stamped and signed off on by a third party engineer, that the methods you want to use, if they are different than what's normally in the code, are equally safe, you are allowed to do it. So what we could do is to educate city planning department staff so that they understand this to help streamline the approval of those buildings that get this kind of engineering review and use other techniques. Or another option we could pursue that would save the expense of having these separate engineering studies every time is one that might also help to bring down, new construction costs quite a bit. And that's to work with private architecture and engineering firms to develop sets of pre-approved plans. This is something that quite a number of rapidly growing cities down south have done. And in these pre-approved plans, you could go ahead and conduct a very thorough safety and engineering review, get those approvals, and then they would be ready to deploy almost immediately whenever an appropriate location was identified within Ithaca. And so in this case, we could, both bring down the cost of designing new buildings by sharing these designs among multiple buildings, um, while also obeying the letter of the existing codes, just going through the process of conducting, the third party safety review for this style of construction in each case, or rather blanketly over a lot of buildings, rather than having to go through, very expensive, time consuming separate reviews for each and every new building. So there's now I would also like us to seek approval from the Department of State for some of these changes broadly in our code. Because there's going to be places where these, pre-approved designs might not work, or someone might just want to do a different building. Um, but that's a little more time consuming. But we do have some options for, between, just making it a matter of policy that with the right review, we will approve those locally as long as they've demonstrated equivalent safety, or by generating pre-approved, pre-reviewed plan sets that we could use throughout the city. There are things we can do in the meantime while we take that longer approach.
Yeah, I think the city has already considered the pre-approved plan set idea, not for apartment buildings, but for auxiliary dwelling units. That they realized that they could really cut the cost for people to adopt, to, let's say, invest in auxiliary dwelling units on their, this is typically single family properties. Uh, if there were, if they didn't have to go through a whole planning process just to create one small apartment.
And I love that idea. And the cities and communities around the United States that have done similar things, it does seem to help quite a bit. I don't see why we should limit that idea only to ADUs. There's a lot of demand in Ithaca for more housing, and especially to try to bring down the cost of new housing. Because in the years since the pandemic, the cost of construction has skyrocketed, going up more than 40% per square foot. And so, and that's before accounting for how much increased interest rates have also driven up the cost of construction financing and mortgages and the way that that comes down into rent as well. And so there's a lot of urgency, I feel, right now for finding creative solutions to bring down that cost of construction and housing wherever we possibly can. And these pre-approved plans, it's worked in other communities. We seem to already be comfortable with this idea for accessory dwelling units in Ithaca. And I think we can expand that and then also find ways to incorporate some cutting edge code reforms into that process in Ithaca. There's and most of these ideas are things that are separately being used to great success by other communities. And so I think it's we have an opportunity to look at combining some of the best proven ideas that other communities have used all together into one package that could really help unlock a lot of new housing for our community.
Well, John King, you and I are both members of Ithaca Democratic Socialists of America, and we are also both members of the Ithaca DSA Housing Policy Committee. If, and you have presented this idea to the Housing Policy Committee or at a housing policy or rather small housing policy committee meeting. If the Ithaca DSA Housing Policy Committee wants to pursue this, what can we do?
So one of the first steps would be trying to lobby some of the members of our local government um, to support the idea. Now, if we wanted to develop a a package or a book of pre-approved plans that um, folks could select from to construct in Ithaca, that would be a budgetary expense. So it would need to go through the Ithaca Common Council. Money would have to be appropriated for that, and we'd have to put some careful planning into thinking, okay, well, where does this funding come from? What's the long-term fiscal impact? Generally, I think that if we can encourage more housing, we'll get property tax revenue from that housing. And in the long run, not even in the long run, and even in the medium term, I think this will easily pay for itself. But trade-offs and decisions will have to be made with finding that money kind of locally, and we'd have to get public buy-in and participation, especially if we're going to see a lot of the same, five, 10, 20 of the same or similar buildings going in. We'd want to make sure to really communicate with the residents of Ithaca to make sure that the designs that are being selected are ones that we really love and we would want to see in our community. So there'd be a lot of outreach and a lot of, just discussing with the city council, city planning staff. Um, but I think one of the best things we can do is just to make sure that our elected representatives have ideas like this on their radar. And to start, just to really educate the community about the potential benefits, both in terms of, just housing abundance and then bringing down housing prices, that we could see. And to reassure them with a lot of the information on just how much safer this style of construction could be than what we have currently in a lot of these older detached buildings.
So in fact, what you're saying is that the dangerous areas in the city are Bell Sherman and West Hill, where you
Or
have the single family houses.
or even I'm in a single family home in Fall Creek, and even this, the home I'm in now, which is beautiful home that I love, statistically speaking, is a lot more dangerous fire-wise than a modern, well-built multifamily building.
Yeah, well, let's not even talk about our
Yeah.
1870s house.
Yeah. So, but yeah, for getting involved, I think just getting educating the public and just reaching out to our representatives to make sure they are aware of these potentials and that we're willing and just building that willingness to make the investments necessary to go
Yeah.
this route would
Well,
be.
yeah, you suggested that I read a couple of articles, and I did, and one of them suggested that opposition was likely to come from firefighters.
It could, and that's where going through these. well, one, going through these statistics and showing how much safer modern multifamily buildings with fire barriers and sprinklers are than existing homes. And then also going through some of the requirements that are put in place in the cities that allow these, um, such as, extra fire protection features, because these have been signed off by emergency personnel in other cities, and they've proven to be very safe. And so the objections you might get from, fire personnel are going to be about the public interest, are going to be about keeping people safe. But if we can show the extra protection that's required and the results and how much safer they are than just the older buildings we have now, I think we can, adequately prove to them that this is not only not more dangerous, but is actually much safer than just allowing the status quo to continue. Because at the end of
Yeah,
the day, they want what's best for the city, and so do we.
right. And they probably don't really mind if they spend less time fighting fires.
Probably not.
Um, okay, so actually I think you said that talking to the fire chief would be an important step.
Yeah. I think talking to local emergency response personnel and, bringing, of course, good details on, how has this process gone in other cities that have done it and what are the additional requirements they have, especially New York City, because it gives us an opportunity to harmonize with the largest jurisdiction in our state. Um, and then also just again, making sure to have the statistics about fire safety in newer buildings generally. So I think if we, to go into these kind of conversations to get that buy-in, just making sure that we have all of the material prepared, because I think the case is very, very well supported. And the places in the United States, as I said, that allow this construction are some of the safer places in the country for fire safety. So I think it's just, well, what's the phrase? Well begun is half done. So, just make sure to really collect the information in a convenient package so that people have these sources right in front of them for decision making.
Okay, well, I'm very glad to hear that no one has said that the key to fire safety is low density.
I'm sure some people might try to make that argument, but
Oh,
the
oh, I have
statistics,
heard it made.
yeah. But I
Um,
think that Pew Research information about fire fatalities in detached homes versus new multifamily, if they were even close, maybe someone could make that argument, but
yeah,
it's such a dramatic difference in safety in those newer buildings that I think we've got all the proof we
yeah,
need that what we're hoping to push for is actually the safest thing for residents.
yeah. Well, I mean, about, I don't know, something like a decade ago, Ithaca had what was sometimes referred to as the parking wars. Um, when there were proposals to reduce minimum off-street parking requirements, and people from places like Bell Sherman came out and said, oh no, these parking requirements are important because they reduce the number of people who may live in a house, and overcrowding is so dangerous. Now, I was sitting there and listening to that and saying, yeah, so if people are forced to move way out of the city, out of the county, and they have to drive to work or school over snowy roads, icy roads, is that safer? But, you
And
know,
also, overcrowding comes more from not having enough homes. I mean, I
well,
I think a lot of folks who've been younger in Ithaca have we've all had that experience where too many 20-year-olds are crowded into one rental house in this town. And it's the way you make sure homes aren't crowded is to have enough of them. It's not has nothing to do with the parking, or it's just you make sure that there are enough homes for all the people
Yeah.
who need them.
Yeah. Well, some of that was the assumption that every student brings a car, which just isn't true.
And if we make our city denser and more walkable, you don't need a car to live here.
Exactly. And you're healthier.
Exactly.
Um, well, if somebody who is not already on the DSA Housing Policy Committee, but hears about this now over radio or television and would like to pursue this, pursue single stair reform, uh, how could they now join with the committee?
So if they would like to email me, what I can do is put them in touch with the chair of the housing committee. And I can tell you without a doubt, we would absolutely love for more people to be involved. So any of them could feel free to email me at johncarltonking@gmail.com. It's just JohnCarltonking@gmail.com.
A nice, clear address that avoids pesky numbers.
No underscores or punctuation or any of that.
Yeah. Okay. Um, John Carlton King at gmail.com.
Yes.
And you don't have to be a DSA member to participate in a DSA committee if you're doing constructive work there.
At the end of the day, it's just people working together who want to make our city better for all of us.
Well, thank you, John King, for telling us about single stair reform. And let's all hope it goes forward.
Well, thank you very much.
This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Teresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.